Welcome to Helsinki Open Waves. You are listening to Ferment Radio, a podcast series on bacterial and social fermentation. Fermentation can incite social action, spark creativity, and bring surprising new taste to our lives. My name is Aga Pokrivka, and I invite you to join us in a conversation on living interconnectivities. From macro to micro, from societal to cellular, and from global to personal. We need new words and concepts to explain the complexity of the world. Metaphors have the potential to be a productive tool to motivate social and political change. Could metaphors contribute to creating a reality rather than just explain it? What about using the human body and all its microbial life as a metaphor of interconnectivity and global relations? The best person to talk about all these questions is Stefanie Fishel. She's a lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Australia, and the author of the Microbial State, Global Thriving and the Body Politic, a book about human bodies and their metaphorical relationship to global politics. Stefanie, how did you begin your journey into these topics?
Let's see where to start. I guess I started out as a little girl who liked to find worms on the sidewalk and take them back to the soil. So it was a bit of a relationship, I think, with the natural world. I paid a lot of attention to it. I grew up in a beautiful part of the world in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, United States. So it was always a background for me. Weekends spent hiking. We fished. We camped. We did all the things outdoors that we could. So I think growing up where I did in the American West made me think more about the way in which nature is more than just a backdrop, but such an important part of our lives. And going back to graduate school, right after 9/11, I decided to go back and get my graduate degree in 2002. And I think a big piece of it for me was that I wanted to be part of making a different world, a better world, a world that was more just and could react to things differently. So I got my first degree at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, which was another beautiful place to be. Vancouver Island, which is off the west coast of Canada. And from there, really thought that I was going to go into international regulation, law, thinking about the UN, thinking about nonprofits, think tanks. But I really did fall in love with academia. I fell in love with being able to read books and think about things and do thought experiments and be around people who also liked that. So then I went on to get my doctorate at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, which was definitely a different experience. It's an urban campus, and the Northeast of America is quite a bit different than the West. And of course, during the long time that one spends in a PhD in the US style, went through many different ways to try to get to what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about how important bodies were and how they were often, in the discipline that I'm in, international relations, often turned into ciphers or discussed as only citizens, or only one kind of body was assumed, or we talked about migrants or trafficking movement, but never about the specificity of those bodies. So when it came down to it, moving deeper and deeper into the body brought me to the microbiome and trying to think metaphorically about how human communities could take good lessons from our smaller brethren and how they communicate and how they work together in particular ways. And that led then to my dissertation research and later to the Microbial State, which is the book that came from all of these musings over about 10 years.
Since you've mentioned about this metaphor of the body and microbiome and so on in international relations, how do you see metaphor itself? Why is it important? And how you use it as a tool, because this is how I understand at least your work or part of your work.
What I tried to do, and the discovery of metaphor really worked for it, and specifically the idea of embodied metaphor and the notion that we understand the world through our bodies and through our experiences in the world. So much of metaphor, of course, metaphor, just to define it, is taking an understanding from one place and putting it in another, right? There are various ways that you can do that. And one of the ways I used it was to kind of trick my discipline into thinking about the way in which we've already used the notion of the body politically, and international relations, along with political theory and all different kinds of political thought, talk about the body politic. And that's often a common way to frame things. And in fact, we often think about our politics, and we talk about our politics through notions of the family, through notions of the body, right? We have the organs of the United Nations, we have the head of state. Our economic and political systems are often modeled after the family, with the father at the head running the finances of the family. And again, you come back to the notion that, well, where's the real body in all of this? And for the most part, we see the real body as the information about it stopping in the 17th century. Like, we're using this body and the idea of the body similar to the way Thomas Hobbes would, thinking about the body as they knew it then. And my thought was, well, bodies are pretty cool and interesting things, and we know a lot more about bodies than we used to. In some ways, bodies stay mysterious to us, and they stay learning more and more about them often doesn't help us understand the processes at some level any better. But the fact that we would have a notion of our bodies from this microbial viewpoint, from a viewpoint in which technologies allow us to see inside of it, both the microscope, MRI, leads you to think that if we're going to take this body politic and say we know things about politics because we know the body, and the body is an old body that hasn't been thought about differently, that looking at the new ways of understanding the body could therefore update our politics. There's a back and forth relationship there. And ultimately, I relied on a lot of English literature and sociological literature around the power of metaphor to change and shift people's beliefs about the world. So it's not just that we understand the world ourselves, but that the world itself acts on us, and that can shift our understanding. So if we see things in metaphorically different ways, then we would treat it and act toward it in different ways in actuality, not just metaphorically.
I'm so happy to hear all of this, because to me, even the whole idea of Ferment Radio and what we are doing here is exactly use the metaphor. However, I don't call it like this, but I think it is this technology, let's say, of a metaphor, which is applied here. And however, the podcast is called Ferment Radio. It was never about a single recipe for any fermented, beverage or dish or whatever. And I'm thinking that in the world, which, at least from my viewpoint, becomes like hyper-realistic, we are so used to, see people's faces on, Instagram or Facebook, maybe with a filter, but still it's pretty close to reality. And with CG, computer-generated graphics, being so good, deep fake, and that we become extremely concrete and direct, that there is not anymore this a looseness of a metaphor, which still leaves some space for interpretation, right?
And there's also, I think, and one of the reasons I think I was led down this path was one of my important mentors and supervisors in my study was Jane Bennett, who works a lot with thinking about the re-enchantment of modern life. How that if we go off of Weber and we think about how modernity led to disenchantment, there's still a lot of magic out there. right? And we can acknowledge that magic, and we can acknowledge, and I do love the idea of playing with fermentation and fermenting. I'm so glad to see you doing it in this context, because I do think it allows us to think about not only just our own, not just our own creative processes, but how we are aided and abetted by so many others in the process. And think about fermentation. We've had a long-term friendship basically with all kinds of critters that make our bread and our beer and our wine, and it's not a creativity that we do alone. It takes a whole crowd of others to get it done. So I think that it's interesting and fun in the fact that the very ways in which you think about these metaphors then can help you construct a world that takes in a wider view, takes in a more magical view of it. And I know we're in the middle of a pandemic and dealing with a microscopic actor that has wreaked havoc globally, socially, economically, and in families. But there's also so much productivity and so much magical happenings all the time. We're really a planet of microbes, and those microbes are part of so much and are so important to our ways of life that I like to think that doesn't always get overshadowed by the fear and anxiety around the invisible is also can be fun. even in the middle of a pandemic, we need to think about the ways in which our ways of interacting with the world have led us to this place. Right? We do know that zoonotic viruses are very much a part of our anthropogenic changes into forests and habitats, and putting more and more animals more closely together, either through the ways in which we sell them to eat them, or just through habitat fragmentation and destruction of habitat. And that's an important reminder that the very small is also important when we think about the ways in which we exist on this planet moving forward. It's not just our charismatic megafauna that need to be thought about and have a place, but rather a whole host of tiny others out there as well.
But coming back to this global relationships, international relations, and this that for so long the main kind of a concepts or understanding of realities through persons or citizens or individuals rather than bodies or, I don't know, microbiomes, for example. Do you have some opinion on why is it so? Why was it so to see the reality this way without bodies, basically?
I think one of the things I discovered right away in thinking about this is that it's not as though we don't think about bodies. We just always assume these bodies to be a certain kind. So bodies and our notions of healthy bodies and what bodies are like are very much tied up with the patriarchy, with our capitalist economic systems, with ideas of white supremacy. I know I've been recently reading into the legacy and history of the body mass index. So BMI itself, our notions of how we see healthy bodies are wrapped up in a particular Frenchman who decided that these kinds of French bodies were the way in which they were healthy. And as a result, these notions of health come down to us, and we find that they're quite racist, right, and misogynist at their base, that health doesn't look a certain way and doesn't have to look a certain way. It's actually quite varied. So I think in that way, our notions of the body are very wrapped up in our bigger ideas of which bodies matter and which bodies we're always comparing the other to. There are a lot of, especially black feminist thinkers like Hortense Spillers and lots of, and the gamut of women of color and Black women would say that it's not their bodies that have ever been, talked about. It's always compared. Those bodies are always assumed to be white, male, and European, as opposed to other ways in which we can imagine bodies to be. So I think that's an important piece to remember. It's not as though we don't talk about bodies, but it's always assumed to be a body of a particular type. And once you dig into that a little, you see the ways in which that works to prop up other systems of oppression and other kinds of ways in which we extract resources from larger systems and then the bodies themselves.
Mm-hmm. So if we imagine, or if we take this metaphor of a body as a state, and whatever happens in those bodies with all its micro relationships is what is happening within state, then what kind of state we get, or what kind of lessons we can learn from it?
Well, I think I guess a word of caution. The thing about metaphors that you have to, and the thing about thinking about bodies in this way you have to remember is that making very facile new metaphors around it isn't necessarily the way to go, right? I know Lynn Margulis and Dorian Sagan in their book on symbiogenesis, which is a different and alternate way to look at evolutionary processes rather than just through Darwin, right? The idea that you are what you eat. We've evolved together with a lot of beings. They really caution in their work that it's not just, okay, we have this simplistic metaphor of, evolution comes from the survival of the fittest. And that fit into a very specific worldview around, especially during colonization and the way in which science worked in particular ways. So it was really easy to say, oh, well, survival of the fittest, right? We can take that and move it into our social systems. And there was quite a debate between Lamarck and Darwin at the time, and everyone was quite aware of what the social and cultural ramifications of this particular understanding of evolutionary theory. It's not as though people didn't think about it at all and suddenly Darwin was like, check it out, right? No, it was part of an ongoing conversation where people were trying to figure out the ways in which we evolved and looking at things from this relatively new scientific point of view, right? Especially for Western science. So when you go to take these metaphors, I think you have to be a bit cautious because there's a lot of ways in which the complex natural world works in particular ways that don't coincide with our metaphors. Balance, for instance, in an ecological system isn't necessarily all, puppy dogs and rainbows, right? Balance, a healthy ecosystem means there are apex predators that are there and keep a certain kind of, like, in quotation marks, balance. So there's a certain kind of violence inherent in the messiness of the way systems attempt to keep one part of another in check to make sure that the holistic system as a whole works. But what I tried to do with the book was talk about the ways in which the state itself is a particular political institution that was created in, around 1648 after a century of crises in Europe and then taken out everywhere in colonialism. And that its particular way of understanding the world, it takes a lot, I guess you could say shorthand, it takes a lot of credit for things that it's not really doing. And what I tried to do in the Microbial State was say, listen, if we think about the way microbes work as bucket brigades, if we think about the fact that in a petri dish, right, you have all the life and activity at the outside, at those liminal spaces at the edge, what if we look at that in terms of borders? Because we do like to border things. That was one of the metaphors I talk about a lot. And through particular embodied metaphors, Lakoff and Johnson have a wonderful book about cognitive embodied metaphors, that we do really understand the world and we love to give it ins and outs and borders, right? You walk into a meadow, right? And you walk in and out of rooms, and we do like to see ourselves as containers. Our bodies feel as if they're containers, and we walk in and out of our spaces as if they're containers. And of course, in international relations as a discipline, one of the ways in which you talk about it is from, I believe it's Giddens, one of the early writers, saying that states are bordered power containers. So the notion then that the state as a person is something, and if you're not familiar with international relations, and one wouldn't expect anyone to be particularly, but very much a debate starting, I imagine it was in the 2000s, trying to think when the article was published, that there was a notion through a social construction that we talk about state as a person. But if we talk about as a state as a person, what do we mean by that, right? And what I did was I alighted that debate and said, listen, you can debate whether we think the state is a person or not. Let's talk about the person part, right? Person part's super interesting. So for me then, I tried to think snazzy and come up with some little, catchy phrases. But one of the things is, if you think about a body in these microbial terms, it turns out we're very diverse and not particularly human, right? So there are all these activities going on at all times through our microbial, microbiomes on our skin and in our guts and then all over, that then we could say, well, if we think about the way in which our heterogeneous societies, especially in settler colonies, right, and in places where there's been a lot of different nationalities coming in, well, what if we did that? What if we saw us all as, and this is a necessary thing, right? And that the mixing and I call it the contaminated state, right? Which I think is a narrow edge to walk on, because a lot of damage can be done and has been done through communities by seeing them as infected or, contaminated in particular ways. The metaphor isn't a metaphor anymore. It becomes something real, right? You don't talk about a person as if they were a louse. They are a louse, right? And therefore can be exterminated. So there's a lot of, again, the cautionary tale with metaphors is also a Nietzschean one, that we can forget that the metaphor was there and it just all collapses in on itself. So the notion then that we would need to understand that we need a lot of things happening and a lot of action at the border and a lot of moving in and out. States think they're keeping us safe and well regulated by being a bordered power container, but in fact it's more about flows. And much critical theory throughout the 20th century was talking about that. Like, it's really about movement, it's not about stasis. And through this metaphor of the bacteria and through immunology, like through itself, through our skin, through our immune system, we actually invite in way more than we keep out, which is basically what our vaccines are doing now, right? They're teaching our body, they're saying it's going to come in. This one's not good, right? Like we need to know this one and we need to incorporate it into ourselves so that it doesn't become pathogenic. And so immune systems themselves are fascinating and not as much about keeping everything out. It's like, come on in, like we need to figure you out. And once we figure you out, we remember you. And when we remember you, we don't get sick, right? Or we don't get as sick.
Yeah, that's super interesting, this notion of a border. Personally, I also I somehow was drawn into it when getting familiar with your work. And I was also reflecting on that border exactly has this notion of something very concrete and very described. From the other hand, let's say if, drugs are smuggled over the border, they belong to the country A from where they came from. But when, the trash from a country B to A is being transported over border, then it's a trash or waste of a country where it arrived to. And the same with animals, right? Where do they belong to? So this is like this, like a blind spots in where something belongs to because of this artificial line or whatever, fence, wall, whatever, however you mark it.
Yeah, I had one of my early supervisor in my master's, his name is Rob Walker. One of his provocations for us was always, listen, there are lines and we've drawn them, but we don't really know on which side of the line that violence is, right? Was it a violence that came beforehand, and we drew a line to say we can fix it, right? We can keep these apart, we can control this, or is the very drawing of the line itself the creation of the violence? So then in international relations, you begin to talk about how it becomes a bit of a con game, right? Like, well, it was bad beforehand, and it would be worse if we didn't have them. Where a lot of people looking at the world itself are saying, but is it though? Right? Like, isn't it your borders that are the problem? And in fact, I mean, I think there's a lot of I think very strange and weird stuff around the open borders debate, right, that happens especially in America. But the idea that the borders are more of a problem than what they're trying to fix, I think is a really important thing to think about. And I think many people have said, well, if you don't want people coming across a border, fix the push, right? Like if we all lived in a better, more just place, people don't want to leave their homes, right? For the most part, no one wants to become a refugee or migrant, right? It's not, you can be a privileged migrant. I'm a privileged economic migrant here in Australia. I'm from the United States, but it's still not easy, right? And especially now when we can't travel and borders are closed, I have given up a lot, right, to come here and to be part of this community. So I do think, the notion of borders is a complex one. And a lot of scholars in my field have talked about how the border itself, though it is a real place and we cross it, right? Real in the sense that, we put our passports out, or when we cross from one country into another, things will change. But the border can also exist thousands of miles away from the border, right? Especially if you have politics or bad policy around immigrants who come in, and the processes in which you bring them in. It can be say, for instance, ICE in America, the people who work with immigration, the immigration office, they are everywhere, right? They're not just at the border. They can come into anyone's house at any point, in the very large country like the United States. So the border itself is a fiction, and it's not as though it's not real. That's one of the things I think that, like, Latour and the STS people do a really good job of saying. It's like, not as though it isn't real. We know very well it's real, but its social construction of it doesn't make it any easier to get rid of, or to talk about, or to think about the ways we could do it in a better way.
Mm-hmm. Do you have some knowledge about how borders itself they impact ecology itself? Because it sounds quite obvious that it blocks some natural flow and migration of some particular species and so on. But it's just my kind of a sense. But I didn't really read anything, or I didn't meet much data on this topic. I wonder if you could share something, if you know more than me, at least.
I do know a little bit more. There's an interesting group of people. There's quite a few of them here in Australia, and there's quite a few in Canada. This is where I'm most familiar with their work on critical border studies. And I do know someone who is really working in that area and thinking about especially the way in which animals, non-human animals, move through, like, it doesn't matter to them, right? So in some ways we do have geopolitical borders that match. So you'll have a border of a nation that's a river or a mountain range or something like that, right? So sometimes the borders match a feature of the world that then has naturally separated one side from another. Other times they don't. So the example I probably know the best is, and because the last 4 years most people know about it, is Trump's desire to build a wall in between the US and Mexico. And first off, right, that's where you see the weird fiction of borders come into play, because so much of the area that you actually can't build a wall, right? It's either water or marshland, or there's something about it that makes it inaccessible to humans. But the places that you can build a wall, it turns out there are a lot of animals that move back and forth in that same space and couldn't. So it's yet another way of habitat fragmentation. So there are these little teeny tiny owls that can only like bop around on the ground. And if there's a wall, there's no getting across it for them, right? And so a lot of you could say that, listen, a wall for a human isn't really a big deal in some ways, right? You can climb over it. You can, throw a mattress over, get over the wire at the top. People can sneak and tunnel under them. And in fact, in modern countries like we have now, you take a plane in. Like the majority of people who come into America, right, come by an aircraft. So the idea that you would keep humans out is actually not exactly accurate. So really what you're doing is destroying the ecosystems down there. You have jaguars that can't move back and forth. You have the birds. In fact, part of the wall was through a butterfly sanctuary, right, where huge amounts of monarchs come and rest, and destroying that area would have been and is, I do believe it happened, detrimental, and in fact, and maybe even pushing some species into extinction. And that's one piece of it, right? The non-human animal and the issues around their habitat fragmentation. And there's also things in the world that just don't obey. Like you were saying, garbage. Our early international treaties were around rivers, like the Danube. Everyone knows that whatever you do upstream comes downstream, right? The ozone layer, the issues we had with chlorofluorocarbons in the 80s and 90s, where we stopped using kinds of hairspray and propellants, because that it's not like that ozone hole is like, hey, that's above Finland, it's your problem, right? It doesn't work that way. And many of them are problems environmentally are inherently global, in that they can't be tacked on to one country in any kind of meaningful way. And that knowing that if water flows through, if you touch an ocean, then those are all very different ways of regulating the world that don't have to do with borders. And even more, like the ocean has no borders. Even the zone, the beach zone, right? The zone where the ocean meets the land, that's a very liminal space, right? It's never the same. It moves back and forth all the time. So you have all of these places that elude our control. And it's to our detriment, and often to the detriment of the non-humans and all the other 8 billion species we share this planet with. When we try to draw lines, they tend to get caught in that line drawing, to the extent that they can be destroyed because of it.
It's very interesting that you brought up this shoreline idea. It's even called shoreline, so it sounds like it's something kind of concrete.
Right.
But even here in Helsinki, there are many examples of developing the shoreline in a way that, you make it concrete. You, like, at least my observation, at least the neighborhood close by where I live is being developed, and the shoreline is being extended, which I think is like a trick to, take a little bit from the sea in order to make a bit of a land. So it's kind of taking the value, I don't know, probably thousands of square meters, because the shoreline is quite long, basically for free, but also kind of sealing it, that it's not anymore like a fluid or liquid border, but something which is very concrete. And I've seen also the comparison of the Helsinki map, like a Helsinki city map, from, I don't know, some tens of years ago and now, and the shoreline was very different. So now it's just being contained by those kind of more squarey, angular lines and, being defined, let's say.
And the ocean rise that we're going to see with climate change is going to affect all that again. And there's been a lot of talk. I mean, all of Australia, right? Everyone lives on this teeny little ridge at the edge. The interior of the country is hot and getting hotter. So the politics around the shoreline itself are similar. And Sydney is famous for its pools, and it made concrete pools in the ocean. And so if you go to Sydney, you can go to these beaches where they've made rock, and in some cases, one of the beaches is they just covered all the rocks up with concrete. So it was easier for people to get down and do their swimming. So there's a lot of, it sounds similar to Helsinki in that way, that when you go there, you know that the shoreline is radically different. And now that the oceans are rising, there's a lot of people blaming their council or their government for their loss of land and wanting to get reimbursed for the fact that they're losing so many meters of their property right into the sea. And who's going to be responsible for that? Who's going to give them the requisite amount of land on the other side, right? That should be theirs. I do see a lot of politics coming up around our shorelines, especially in temperate areas where that's where we live, becoming quite, if they're not fraught now, which they are, very much more fraught in the future.
But I would like to move us now to kind of a dream space, talking about all those, things and how much we can learn from treating body as a metaphor for state and like a global relationships. And I wonder what would be the imaginary. I say imaginary not just because that it's impossible, but more like we will not build here a serious political program or something. But I wonder, what would be this political form, or what would be the structure inspired from all of this which we are talking about, from nature, body, applied in real life? What it would be, what features it would have?
That's a wonderful question. And I know I've spent a long time thinking about how the only way the world changes really is through creative people reimagining it. And that reimagination comes everywhere, right? It's not just through poetry or through novels, but rather through the way in which science sees itself as something different, right? And creates new world. I used Feyerabend in the book to talk about how you have to dream a new world. So I guess if we were to kind of riff on it together right now, thinking about it, right, you'd have to be very fluid. You'd have to realize that you'd have to be very comfortable with contingency and change, and you couldn't ever set down roots in the way that maybe we have in the past, right? You would have to be a cosmopolitan, and a cosmopolitan that understands things in a way that's not just around humans, right? We're not just either citizens or humans, but in fact a cosmopolitanism that would have to encompass more than that. My good friend and co-author has been working on this, so I've been thinking about it, like, how do we even imagine this? Latour has a really interesting early article that he calls the thing politic, a parliament of things. And he said, listen, if we did have a global democracy, wow, right? How would we put everything in there? And what would we do? And I know we struggle anyway in our fields, in whatever field we're in, with how we speak for something or how we represent them, and with consent, and with what it means to try to translate. Even in human communities, right? We've got all these problems of translation. We can all learn how to speak each other's language or have a common language. I'm lucky in that in that sense, in that English is my language, and that's what has colonized the world in so many places. I can go everywhere. But what does it mean with beings that we share this earth with, that are vital to the health of our ecosystems? We'll never share a common language. As much as we'd love to have the dog in Up, where we, he speaks to us through a translator, we can't rely on language giving us some kind of clear and perspicuous knowledge of the world. We have to become open then to other ways of understanding. And importantly, I think whatever this being of the future would be, it would have to know that humans aren't at the top of a some kind of evolutionary ladder, that our way of thinking and our exceptional ways in which our brain has become what it is isn't everything, right? So you'd also have to be really open to change and open to, I think, the things that are different are magical, not terrifying, right? And have a way to be able to code that in such a way that you wouldn't always respond with fear and violence. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, something which comes to my mind is that probably there are no universal solutions. Because if we think of the bodies, and we were talking previously about this variety, that, this notion of one type of a body, which is very particular, is all wrong. Then thinking, of course, there are global problems, which we've mentioned, like a ozone hole or even COVID, right? Like it kind of puts everybody on more or less the same page. But even reacting to, let's say, even like a COVID situation, I believe it is quite particular in a different context, and even in one city, it also depends which, social group you belong to, and you might be exposed to different risks, right, regarding that. So I think the sensitivity to this various contexts should be embedded there in the state we are dreaming about.
Yeah, it should be. And I like that you brought up the universalizing, because I think the trick that always gets played is that it's called universal, but it's really based on a very particular set of beliefs from a particular place, right? So it'd say, oh, well, we all universally believe in this. You could say that certainly for some things that seem to come across as important, but at the same time, we would have to have notion of how to, and not to always let that dip into relativity, like you couldn't understand because of this, but the ways in which we could, yes, very authentically decide something. It really does lead us to, and not having a whole bunch of rule-bound ways in which to make decisions. And isn't that difficult for bureaucracies or for all the ways in which we tend to think about our human organizations? They're very much built on, well, if this happens, then you do this, and then this is checked off and that happens. And throughout my studies, what I've found over the last, what has it been? I don't know, I started all this in 2002. A good 20 years of thinking about it is that the more we list things out and make rules for them, the more the exceptions tend to prove problematic and not talk about the rule at all. And the more those rules themselves end up being even worse than what we're trying to counter with it. As much as we want that desire. And maybe it comes down to, I hate to always come back to individual bodies, but maybe thinking about the ways in which we want control, and we want to oppress other people, and we want to have these things control us and tell us what to do. I think the pandemic has maybe taught us a lot about how much we need flexible ethical systems that can respond to the real in ways that make sense. I've recently got done writing a couple things on COVID that are coming out soon. And one of the things, like, everyone talks about being at war with the virus, but it's the virus is not the problem, right? It's our already existing social and political systems that make some people less important and that create a world economy that's more important than the health of the planet environmentally. That this is only bearing in a world of wounds that was there already, right? This virus just enters into a place that's already profoundly flawed. And being able to blame it on the virus is all well and good, but in reality, the virus is only showing us what was there before, exacerbating the problems. And certainly it shows us that with bordering. we're only as healthy as the sickest person on the planet.
I'm going to keep with me the following thought from this conversation with Stefanie Fishel. Transformation will come not just from within the body, but rather in the way that this body connects with other bodies, organisms, and environments. And what will you embody from this conversation yourself? If you would like to know more about the show, listen to this episode again, or find previous episodes, please go to helsinkiopenwaves.com or fermentradio.com. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. I'm always looking forward to hearing from you at hello@fermentradio.com. Ferment Radio is broadcast by Helsinki Open Waves, supported by Culture of Cultures and produced by Super Eclectic. Thank you for listening, keep fermenting, and stay tuned for the next episode of Ferment Radio.